Hey there, welcome to today's episode. We are diving in live, unedited session to rainy afternoon in London, and I just want to sit down, do a first impression of the MPC 3.0 update that we've all been waiting for, take a look around it, what's new, what's different, and we'll cook up a little bit of a beat so you've got some idea of how to use some of the basic functions and just get started with this. We're using the MPC 1 Plus, but you can follow along if you have an MPC 1, a Live 2, an X or an XSE. The only thing that is different is the actual physical hardware unit, but the internal software, the brain if you like, is exactly the same. What you see on screen will be the same. This is a new user interface. Previously, let's cover the big changes. We had 3 sections on our main page, which is what we're looking at now. So when you boot up the device, this is pretty much what you'll see. We used to have 3 bars with sequences, tracks, and then your programs. Those tracks and programs were interchangeable, so you could create a track and then assign a program to it, which meant that you could always swap that out. You could use MIDI information and then use different instruments and things. There is some creative flexibility that has been lost here because of that. However, it was also probably one of the things that for new users, people unfamiliar with the MPC workflow, would probably get tripped up on the most. You would set up your track and then your program and get your drums working. You accidentally switch that program type out, and all of a sudden your drums disappear and everything was lost. It was a big point of confusion until you understood the software. However, I'm a slightly older guy, and I do believe there's nothing wrong with studying and spending some time on your device and learning it. I have no problem with the MPC workflow prior to the 3.0 update. I'm in a very fortunate position that I own multiple MPCs, so I'm happy to update this one, but I'm keeping some of my other MPCs with the traditional workflow because sequences, tracks, and programs all made perfect sense to me. So sequences, tracks, and programs with this interchangeability has gone, and we are replaced with just sequences and tracks. The confusion comes in because I think the terminology is changing. They're now just trying to put everything under the title track. So program is kind of disappearing a little bit. However, programs still do exist. If we take a look at adding a new track, which we can do with this big button at the bottom, you still choose a type of track that you want to make, and it still uses a program in exactly the same way that it always did. Gone are clips. I don't know what happened to clips. We'll look at that in another video. But we've got audio tracks, drum tracks, plugins, key groups, MIDI, and CV, just like we had before. The difference being is that they're not interchangeable anymore. So if you create a track with a drum program, if you want to still use the program terminology, that is just baked in and you can't switch it out anymore. If you want to change that, you'll have to delete that track, create a new track, and whatever the type that you create is, it's going to be set in stone. That's the key difference. It's going to make sure that you can't accidentally switch the programs up. But the people that like the flexibility are definitely going to complain about that. I've already seen it in the YouTube comments. Some people are going to want to stay with this current version, and some people are going to move on to 3.0. It's going to just depend on your preference. If I'm being truly honest, I never really took advantage of the fact that you could switch the programs. When I worked, it was kind of just like this. I have a track with a program type. That would be me for the project. And, if it's going to be my drums, it's going to be my drums. Very rarely did I switch that out. So I'm not really going to miss it personally, but, that is what it is. If you want to change, there's a couple of things here. First off, if you're looking at my screen, it looks slightly different. If you've just downloaded this update, you might be seeing some WAV files and some stuff going on here. That is because by default, it has a factory project enabled to load every time you turn on the device. Go into your menu, whether you want to do it via the touchscreen or the menu button. Go to Preferences. The bottom where it says Project Load and Save. I think Factory Project is the default, which loads up this trap kit. You don't want it. Get rid of it. Move it to an empty project. Set your project defaults as well if you want. I like 78 BPM because I'm a hip-hop guy. You can change a few parameters in there if you like. Just means every time you turn on the device, you get a nice blank project and you can start from the beginning. So if that looks slightly different, don't be confused. Also, should have mentioned while we were in that menu and preferences, if you go to the top, if you absolutely hate 3.0, just downgrade back to 2.15 or 16, whatever we were last on. Sounds a little bit negative when you say downgrade, and I'm kind of curious what that means. They're obviously giving you the option to move away from 3.0 if you don't like it. But what does that mean for the future? Does that mean that they're going to continue to sort of support a 2. Whatever version and support a 3.0? Or is that just going to stay whatever the last update was and they're only going to be focusing on 3.0 for the future? Only Akai can tell us that as time moves on. So let's go back to the main page. This is our new user interface. Long gone are the 3 segments, and now we kind of have 2. Everything else on the face of things is kind of similar, and it's really only this main page that has changed drastically. If we take a look at the browse menu, looks exactly the same. Yeah, it's slightly different shades of grey, and maybe the icons are a bit more modern or whatever, but ultimately it looks the same. The sampler looks the same. So don't be too frightened by the update. It's not going to feel as different as you think. It's mainly this main page, and once you've got your head around that, it's going to be fine. That is one thing I will say as well. The 3-bar and the being able to be tripped up between tracks and plugins, I get that for new users was kind of confusing. I wouldn't say, though, that if I was a brand new user, I just bought my first MPC, and I've got 3.0 as the first piece of software I'm using on it, I still don't think this would make a huge amount of sense. There's going to be some studying, some work involved in learning the device, and I really don't think that's a bad thing. I think you should learn your device, get to understand it, know it, spend a bit of time on it, and then it will reward you with the benefits of putting that work in. That is one thing I'll say. So this is the new screen. Sequences were always at the top. We always had this kind of bar across the top that had some information. The playhead still works the same. You can see that moving through. That plays and loops around to the sequence length that you have set. So in this case, it is playing for 2 bars. There's no volume, of course, because we haven't got anything loaded in. Gives you the measure, the bar, the beat, the tick, where you're at. You can access timing control here. You can do it from the hardware as well, but it's exactly the same menu. We have the metronome. You can dive in and you can set that as well. Automation, I believe, was always up there. Sequence was always at the top because you start with sequences, whether it's one long sequence or multiple sequences that you chain together. We now have an arranger in order to do that, but I do believe that the traditional song sequencing mode still exists. So if you prefer just working in the sequences, putting those together, I think you can still do that on this device. And so, yeah, that hasn't really changed too much. Just a new arranger, which we'll talk about later on. Sequence here, the BPM, let's say we want to change it to 80 BPM. You can do sequence or global, so you can set independent sequences, independent tempos even per sequence, or have just one global tempo for the whole project. The pencil icon was always here, maybe slightly different. It opens up the sequence edit function, so you want a half length, double length, copy, paste, all that kind of stuff. You can do that here. The big difference is that it used to allow you to edit the name inside of this menu, but to edit the name of a sequence now, you long press and then call it whatever you want. In this case, I'm just going to call it loop because that's what we'll do. Underneath, you have your bar length for the sequence, so nice and easy, 2 bars in this case. You've got your start and end. If you're unfamiliar with that, if you make an 8-bar sequence, just as an example, and I just want to dial in on a piece of that, I'm working on a certain point and I don't want to listen to the whole 8 bars, you can dial the start and end point in. So maybe I only want to start at bar 3 to bar 5 or bar 6, whatever. You can do that. Transpose here, you can transpose the MIDI notes up and down, and I'll show you that in a second. We've got the looping function as well, so you just want to stop it from looping around. You can do that with the loop button. Underneath, we get to our tracks. So rather than the kind of 3 sections, to me, this is like 2 sections. We've got the looping section, and then we've got the tracks, and the tracks has a little bit more real estate now for some other things that we can look at. So we've got our first track. A couple of things to notice. The track button, I think in the old version, if I remember correctly, this used to add new tracks and delete tracks. But what it does here is it just scrolls through any tracks that you have loaded in the project. We've only got 1, so it goes to submix next. But if you had multiple tracks, you could flick through that. Loop is currently highlighted because it's got this little red box around it. And the reason I mention that is because if you're like me and you prefer working with the encoders and the buttons, less on the touchscreen, and you want to scroll through your tracks, you don't want to have to press these buttons, you can highlight the track. You'll see because it's got the red line underneath, and then I can scroll through all of the tracks in my project. I can also do it from the buttons here, which is the minus and the plus. You can do exactly the same thing. And the reason I'm laughing a little bit is because in typical MPC fashion, you can see I can use these buttons, I can use the encoder, I can use these buttons. I can also hold main, and I can select other tracks that way if there were multiple tracks in here. Lots of ways to do exactly the same thing. When you've got your track highlighted and you press the pencil icon, you get the options to edit the track. So you've got delete and all that kind of stuff. When you press arrangement and then you press the pencil button, you get the options to play around with the arrangement. And of course, this is new to this user interface. We can see some of this arrangement view, some MIDI information right here on the home screen. And when we put something in a second, that will become clearer. With arrangement, you also have some punch-in options for recording and stuff like that. We're not going to go into every single thing, but just so you've got a basic idea of what's happening. With drum, with our tracks selected even, we have the option to duplicate tracks using this little plus icon. It's nice and easy. And I accidentally just pressed that there. We'll come back to that in a second. But underneath, we've got monitor, so for monitoring the audio tracks and stuff, length, sequence, velocity, layers. Typical things. As I said, we won't go into every single option. You'll notice that if you don't have the default track kit loaded up where you'll see the waveforms, on a blank pad where there's nothing, you can browse from here and you can record as well. Just takes you to the sampler, the same as pressing the sampler button or the browse button. There's some other things we'll look at later on, but don't be confused that these are particularly new sections or anything. If you press the browse shortcut, it takes you to browse. If you press browse here, it takes you to browse. And of course, if I press browse on the device, takes me to browse. It's just the way the MPC works. It means you can tailor it so that it suits your workflow. With that said, on the left-hand side, we have some shortcuts. I haven't booted up my MPC 1 Plus in a little while because I've been busy with other things. I think you could always access some shortcuts on the left-hand side. I think you can. Anyway, if you couldn't, you can now. And if you go to the menu, you can drag and drop these, just like the applications on a mobile phone, into this menu and select 5 of your favorite, whatever, functions, menus, things that you want to get to. Just quickly while we're in here as well, so that it's out the way, you want to change your pad colors and track color. You do that with pad color. Follow track just makes everything the same color as the currently selected track. So if the track that boots up by default is red, then if you do follow track, all of your pads will be red. But you can set them individually. You can do all pads to a certain color, independent of the track color. And you can also set a single pad as well. I'm not going to bother with it for now. I just want to show you that it's in here. So yeah, you can mess around with the colors. So you've got these shortcuts you can set up. Just next to those, there used to be a little eye icon that would open up and it would show you like a little mini mixer so that you didn't necessarily have to go into the track mix and pad mix view, which still exist. They just look a little bit nicer now, and we'll talk about that later on. But you can press on either of these two channels. Just while the colors are on my mind, when you boot up a default project, it just randomly assigns a color here. So if you've done the same thing, you've got a blank project and for some reason your track is red or blue or green, don't get confused by that. It just randomly assigns the first default to whatever color it feels like. When we press either of these two channels, it opens them both up. And whenever you press them again, it just closes them. The gray channel is your main output channel. So you know that because it's got the little crown at the top. You can adjust your volume, automation, record, mute, panning, effects, send effects, all of the stuff that you could do previously. But it's nice that you can do it right here from the main screen. And the one next to it on the left is the currently selected track. So we can see that it's got the same title. It is the same color. You want to do the same thing. Adjust the overall volume of a track. You can do that. Send effects, all the same things, mute, solo. Let's say you want to do it on a pad basis because you only want to adjust the volume of one particular pad. Then you can switch to this little single square. You've got 4 squares and next to it there is a single square. If we press that, again, sometimes I have to press few things. It's because of my anti-glare screen protector. It's not as sensitive as it is without it. I've got these pads, so when I press the pads, you can see the pad number changing. Just means, of course, on an independent pad basis, I can reduce the volume of a single pad. I can mute that pad. I can put the effects on and do all the same things. I'm going to put that back to the default and close this up. So really, that is the new home screen. And as I mentioned, most of the other menus look kind of the same as they did before. So as long as you understand what's going on here, you're not going to be too stuck with getting, into this new way of working. We can browse for some samples now and start to put something together. So I'm going to click browse. This screen looks exactly the same as it always did. You've got the file types that you can search for. You've got some favorites. You've got the content on the left-hand side. Places is where you access your SD. In this case, I want my SD card. And I'm going to use my jog wheel, but you can use your finger, however you want to navigate, to open up a drum folder, Beat Butcher. Let's get a kick drum, start with that. Same as before, there are some audition options. So you want to have auto audition, set the volume for the samples as you're scrolling through, you can. Let's say this is the kick drum that I wanted. The only difference now is that it actually tells you that you're going to load that to the sample pool if you don't choose load to load it to a pad. That's pretty handy because the sample pool's always been hidden. It's a little bit of a thing that you have to know the MPC workflow in order to know that there is a sample pool there. But when I choose a pad and I load this, anything that is loaded into the project still ends up in the sample pool. But sometimes you don't assign things to pads and you click load or you send something there. A typical example of that would be if I've got the sampler open, I just want to record a bit of vinyl. I don't want to record it directly to a pad because I want to go into sample edit and chop it up and then assign it later on to the pads. That's the typical way of working for me. So where does that sample live in the meantime? Well, it lives in the sample pool, so I can send it over to the sample pool. It just sits there until I need it. Another reason that's important is because when you want to send your project to somebody or just be organized, take up less storage space, let's say you've tried out 10 different kick drums and then you've settled on one. The rest of those have been loaded at some point, but then you've taken them off the pads because you're only settled on one kick drum. All of those other samples will still exist in the sample pool, and when you want to send your project out, it's going to make the file bigger. You're sending a bunch of unnecessary information. So you inside of the sample pool, you can long press on any sample and you can delete that. We can also start setting our samples to stream from disk, which is handy, and I'll talk more about that in another episode, but it's a nice little feature. So if you want to go back to browse, you press sample assign, and then we can just load in a couple more drums. So let's find a hi-hat. Let's say this one. I can double click, load it in. I can press the encoder to load it. And if we go and find a snare drum, say this one, I can load it from the screen down here as well. Got some drum sounds. What's really nice with the new user interface is that when we've loaded some samples in, we can now see them laid out on our pads, which is great. Big reason for that is because not only can we see them visually, we can actually tweak them. So the start and end points, I can move around. Particularly useful if you've got some sample chops on here, you'll be able to see those sample chops, and maybe you just want to do some very quick editing, move things around a little bit, rather than having to go into program edit, which still exists and you can still do it that way. You would have to go to program edit, then choose samples and do it from here. You can do some of those basic functions from the pads. There's still going to be reasons you're going to come into your program edit. We'll talk about that later on, but it's nice that you got this view. You can also zoom in on these as well. If you use your fingers, you can zoom right in and yeah, just dial it in a little bit more. So we've got some samples loaded. Just need to create a basic loop to get started. And to be organized, I'm going to long press on the drum track and change it to drums because that's what we're going to be putting in here, and close that. Going to leave the timing correction at 1/16 notes. I've got my metronome set, all good. Record and play start. You can hear, because of the timing correction, the slight human swing that I put in there has been lost, but that is still the same as it ever was. If I press timing correction and via the hardware or via the button up here, I can go to swing and dial some swing in here. So let's put like 65. Let's see what that does for it. We'll click do it. Hopefully that will just put a little bit more of that swing back into the drums. Nice and simple. If we click on our arrangement now, we can see that MIDI information, which is really cool. Nice to be able to see it from the main page. Before, you had to go into the grid view, and you still can do that, and you can do it with your hardware. If you've got a grid button, in this case on the MPC 1 Plus, you can do Shift and Grid. It will take us into the grid. Or you can double click on this and it will open. We now have the grid view. This looks pretty much the same as you remember. If you're previous to 3.0, you've been using the MPC for a while, this will look very familiar. The same tools at the top for zooming in, selecting tools, deleting, drawing notes in, beats and measures. The big things that are different is mainly that we have a list editing view that you can access from here now. So if you're into list edit, which I've never really bothered with, you can do. You can list edit. You can also use the arranger. So this is the other big ticket item. We've been waiting for this for a little while. Some people certainly, because if you like using a DAW, you're familiar with FL, Ableton, Logic, whatever it is, you want this linear way of working from left to right with tracks that stack on top of each other, something that is very familiar with the DAW. You can now do that on the MPC. Again, just for complete honesty, I probably will stick to working in sequences and chaining those sequences together, but it is nice that we have these options that you can use an arranger if you want to. The only time I might be more interested in the arranger is if I wanted to record some scratches in real time on like an audio track. It'd be kind of nice to do that like a DAW, might be an easier workflow. I'm not against the arranger in any way. It's just another tool in the toolbox that is here. But if I am being honest, I kind of like making sequences and then kind of just, sequencing those out. That's just the way that I've always worked. But this is here now. You can add new tracks. You can also access that MIDI information, the grid view, by clicking on the arrow, and whatever track you have selected, you will see that MIDI information. We've only got one track, of course. I'm going to close that for now. Let's go back to main, and let's add in a couple of other tracks. I'm going to go back to my tracks. The first track is just going to be a temporary track. There's a reason for that. I just want to show you the transpose function, and the easiest way to do that was with a plugin. So I'm going to do a new track, and I'm going to choose plugin as the type of track. It loads up the electric ballad EP by default. I'm not sure if that's just on my device or whether it does it on every single one. Maybe it depends on the plugins that you've bought. If you want to access the parameters for that plugin, for that instrument, you can click this little icon and you can see you can change everything in here. So that is the ballad EP. Let's say we switch that out to, I don't know, whatever. Hard whirly. You can change the plugin too from this menu, but I just want to show you quickly that if you go to main, one of the shortcuts is the option to open up your instruments. Anything grayed out is something that I don't currently own, and I really don't buy these or use these very much. I'm a sample guy. But let's say I wanted a synth. I could go into the tube synth here, Dyno Supersaw. Sounds fun. That like Usher sound or something there. Let's go to main and go back. You will notice it has swapped that out inside of our track. So we're now using this one. And if I wanted to tweak those parameters, I can come into the instrument and tweak them there. I'm just going to record any old nonsense. Doesn't matter. It's just something that I can show you the transpose in action. You get the idea. We're not going to keep this. But it is mainly just to show you the transpose. If you're familiar with this, you know what transpose does, but for those that might not, then this is what it does. Just allows you to pitch your MIDI up and down. You get the idea. Useful if you got some chords, you just want to try a different vibe, mess around. It works even with a drum program. That's why transpose is still an option there. But you would need enough samples loaded into that drum program in order to come up like, as many semitones as you need to. I'm just wanted to use a plugin because it's an easy way to show you that. I'm going to go to the pencil icon and I'm going to delete that track because we're not going to be using it. I do want to create a new track though. I want to create a drum program again, drum type of track, so that we can do some recording from an external source. I've got my iPad hooked up to the left of me. When you press record, it still goes to the same sampler. It's not a different sampler. But with pad tap enabled here, when I press a pad and I tap it as it suggests, it's going to begin to record, and then I can just keep tapping and putting slices in as I go through. It's another way of working, but I kind of like this, and I just wanted to show you it in action. Traditionally, I use the sampler. I bring the sampler in and I chop it up using sample edit, which you can still do. But this is quite fun as well. I've got a sample on the iPad to the left of me. It's a little bit awkward where I have to reach though. Let's just check that we got the sample loaded up. I need this set to in. And I just made this fake jazz sample. I don't want to use anything famous. I'm going to start the first pad. There'll be a little bit of dead space, but just because I'm reaching awkwardly. And I'm just going to tap in a few slices where I want them. That's going to be good enough. We only need a few sample chops. Now when I go back to main, you will notice some pads have been lit up. And when I click on one of these, we can see they are our sample slices. So a really cool way of working because we're already into sample chopping, and because we have the ability to just move the start and end points here, we can do some tidying up nice and easily, just shift around the slice points. I still think there is a big benefit to coming into Program Edit and having the bigger real estate to tidy things up. And it is also the same for Sample Edit. So these are the pads, samples loaded up. We've got this bit of dead space because of the way I just recorded that. If I go into Sample Edit, looks like it always ever did. Slightly different, feel to the user interface, but you'll be familiar with this if you've used the MPC prior. You've got your stems in here. You want to come in and start doing all your stem work. We're not getting into that in this particular video, but you can. But let's say I want to start by just chopping out the dead space. This is a nice big screen in order to do it. And it's still the traditional trim mode or chopping mode here. So when you want to chop samples the old school way, or not even old school, but the way that I do it normally, you can. Just going to drag this across. Just get rid of that dead space, which I can do by process, and I can do discard or truncate and get rid of that. The sample is also a little bit quiet, so if I go to process and go to normalize, I can click do it, and that sample has now been trimmed and normalized. When I go to main, you'll notice on this first pad, it's changed. It's also changed inside of Program Edit, so it's all connected, which is really nice. Inside of Program Edit, while we're here, we can go to global, and my go-to thing is to pitch samples up and down. They're already in a choke group, so we can just mess with these. I'm going to put full level on as well because they're sample chops. Let's say that's what I wanted. Pitch them down 2 semitones. I'm not going to be too fussy about where the chops are and anything else. We're just going to cook up something. The big benefit I would say about Program Edit, if you're going to chop this way and not do it with the sort of sample edit mode, is that you can just dial in a little bit closer with the Program Edit. This is a small screen when you want to make really fine adjustments. And if we listen to some of these, let's just listen closely. Yeah, with a pad like this, there is a definite click and a pop in here. And so I would want to really zoom in and just try and dial out that click if I can. Still there a little bit. You have to play with that. I'm not going to bother for this particular episode, but that might be easier to do that via Program Edit and samples, where again, you've got a slightly bigger screen that you can look at. But it is cool that if you really want to, you can do it from the main page. So we've got some sample chops. Let's just play the beat, see if we can work out something we can record in for 2 bars. Can be absolutely anything for this episode. That's going to be good enough. Double click your stop button, always kills all samples as well. Just again, if you're a new user, record and play start. Good enough starting point in terms of, you were cooking upbeat. That's how we do it. Tidy up, better sample chops, all of that stuff. You get what I'm trying to say. So we've created 2 tracks. And of course, if we look at arrangement, we can now see the MIDI information for that particular track as well. And at this point, yep, I could come in and I could start adding more layers, a bass line, and do all of that. But rather than making this episode really long and doing the same thing that we do, we are really just talking about the features of the MPC 3.0 update. So I want to dive back into the arranger and just show you, if you're interested in the arranger, how you can do some basic editing functions in there as well. So if we double click this, it's so annoying it doesn't work sometimes. Come on. Yes, there we go. This is why I prefer the buttons sometimes, because it just works. We've got our MIDI information that we can adjust because we're currently looking at it in grid view. But if we switch back over to the arranger again, you can see we've got our tracks laid out like a typical DAW. So if you want to build a song this way and, do something with a track and the arranger, you can use the edit functions and this looping tool that we've got across the top of the screen in order to do that. So the first thing is we've only got 2 bars. Let's say, this was going to be the main body of the song, something that we're interested in. We can go to edit and we can just extend this out. So if I double the length, we go to 4 bars. If I double it again, we get to 8. 16. Let's just leave it at 16. Let's not make it crazy. You don't see 16 bars here initially. You need to zoom, and all of a sudden, you've got 16 bars. I had some reservations about how this would work on like this small screen. I believe this is a 7-inch screen. Didn't know whether it'd be a bit faffy, but actually, it works pretty well. The only thing is, you do need to make sure you can get the handle of this and move it where you need to in the bigger view. With Koala Sampler, when you're moving sample start and end points, it's got this nice function that if the end handle is off the screen, as long as you just grab somewhere on the loop and pull it, it just grabs that end handle for you. This, you definitely have to expand out and, zoom in. But if this was the beginning of our track, and just a real basic example, let's say I wanted to create like an intro to this. I don't want the beat, the drums to be playing at this point. I can loop up however many bars I want that for. In this case, 2 bars, go into something like edit and use erase as a function. It's going to ask me what do I want to erase from bar 1 to bar 3. Yep, the first 2 bars, that is okay. And then it asks me what I want to erase. Now, we didn't rename our track before. We should have done that to be more organized and called that chops. But I know the first one is where the drums are. So I want to move that. I don't want to take out my chops. I want to just have that as the drums. Click do it. And you will see it has deleted that first section. So if we drag our little loop all the way back out to our 16 bars, I'm not going to play all of this because it's very repetitive. But you get the idea. I can begin to start making a song structure just like I would in a DAW. I can make new sequences, new parts, drag and drop those in, switch things up. So there's a lot of flexibility here as an arranger. It is very DAW-like. Whether or not I become a convert to this way of working, I'm just not 100% sure. I've always enjoyed just making different sequences, even just making the whole beat concept in one sequence and then deconstructing that, just taking elements out. Mutes are definitely coming back. I know there's been a lot of talk about the mutes, and obviously being able to mute tracks and do that kind of stuff was useful for that workflow. That is coming back. We've been told by Akai that's coming back. So if I didn't mention that earlier, don't worry about that. Mutes are on the way back at some point. So there we go. I think in a nutshell, I'm going to kind of leave it there. Let's just quickly go back to the arranger. Let's see if I can get that to double click again. It's being a little bit slow on my device, but let's hit play. You get the idea. It'd be a way that you could build an intro, build something, whatever you want. There's plenty of clicks and pops in those sample chops that we should address, tidy things up, and bass lines, whatever you want to do. But so that we're not making this video too long, I'm going to sign off there. I hope this has been an interesting first look at the MPC 3.0. In the future, I will be putting together more little mini tutorials about doing certain tasks. I don't want to do a whole playlist like I did with Koala because it's a lot of work. And with something that's as complicated as this device, I'm really not the best person to tell you about sequencing, external MIDI gear, and all of that kind of stuff. So whatever tutorials I make, there'll be smaller, little in-depth chunks, but probably based around the idea of sample-based hip-hop making. Anyway, I'm going to sign it off. I hope you guys have enjoyed it. Take care, and I'll see you in the next episode.